Assalamu alaikum, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. We did two examples in the last clip to understand how some apparently disconnected, incoherent passages coming together, if considered a little more deeply, give us meanings which bind the two passages together in a manner that the presentation looks extremely impressive. One might say, why should one bother so much to find such coherence in the Quran when even when we read different verses, passages separately isolated from each other, we still get a lot of wisdom and meanings from them. The fact of the matter is that when you read a book and you read it in a manner that you are able to understand and appreciate that one passage is leading to another, in a manner that there is deep wisdom hidden behind it, and the second leads to the third and so on, you get impressed by the book. And to be honest, it's a very important relationship that one needs to have with the Quran to be impressed with the Quran. Believe you me, most of the Muslims are talking about the Quran, that it's God's book. They believe in it most certainly, but it's more of a lip service. We are emotionally attached to it, but what is called being impressed from deep down is not there, because we don't actually understand the Quran as a completely well-organized, coherent book. And unless we are able to unfold the hidden meanings that are there in the Quran for us to look for them, we're not going to be impressed by the book. But let me also mention that it's not just that we go for understanding coherence in the Quran to be impressed by the book. That in itself, I've mentioned, is an immensely important objective. But there are many occasions when one might actually not understand what the book is saying, what the Almighty is conveying, if we do not give proper consideration to the fact that there are verses coming one after the other in a sequence for a definite purpose. You ignore that sequence and you will come to a conclusion which would sometimes be very different from what the Almighty wants us to conclude. Let me give you an example. Chapter 3, Surah Al-Imran. In the first part, that is first half of the chapter, the subject matter is invitation to the people of the book, and it talks about some of the wrong attitudes shown by the people of the book towards Islam, towards the message of God, towards the children of Ishmael, so that they and people are not able to understand that this last message is from God. Now, in order for them to be able to do so, the Jews conspired to remove the relationship of Abraham from Mecca, so that people, after reading the Bible, the Old Testament, would not come to learn about the fact that Ibrahim alayhi salam, Abraham, came to Mecca, and that there is a very strong relationship between him and the holy city. They will not be able to come to the understanding that the last prophet, who is from the progeny of Ishmael, is actually from the progeny of Ibrahim, and therefore is the promised prophet whose mention is to be found in Torah as well. So the Jews did many things in Torah to remove the mention of Mecca from the Old Testament, so that when people would not know that Mecca has anything to do with Abraham, they would not even think of the possibility that this particular city can have any significance in the eyes of God. Therefore, the Almighty revealed a few verses to show that most certainly this city, Mecca, is the one that that was the place which was visited by Abraham alayhi salam, along with his son Ishmael, and they erected the house of God. So, chapter 3, verses 96 and 97, they mention, Inna awwala baytim wudiya linnas. Indeed, the very first house that was erected for worship for the mankind, Lallazi bi Bakka, is the one that is located at Makkah. Bakka is the old name of Mecca. So, in the Old Testament, the city was mentioned as Bakka. But then obviously, with the passage of time, it changed into Mecca. That's something that quite often happens in languages. That's what the Quran is claiming. And it says, Mubarakam wa hudal lil alameen. It's a city which is blessed and is a guidance for humankind. The next verse 97 says, Fihi ayatum bayyinat. In it, there are many signs. Signs of what? Signs of the fact that this city is the one where the first house of God was established. Signs of the fact that Abraham came to this city and he was the one who erected the house of God along with his son Ishmael. The Quran goes on to mention some of those clear signs. It says, Maqamu Ibrahim. It has the station of Abraham, the place where Abraham stayed. So when you go to Mecca, you would come to learn about the fact that the city is telling you that this is the place where Abraham came and he settled for a while, spent some time. There is a particular place actually which is known by that name. Number 2, وَمَنْ دَخَلَهُ كَانَ آمِنًا. And whoever enters it shall be safe, shall come into a place that is secure. That is, in Mecca, because of the status of that city, the holy, divine nature of the environment, the Almighty, ever since the time of Abraham, had decreed that this city is a city of peace. And so much that if somebody enters the city, it is as if he is in complete peace. Nobody can kill even a bird, nor pluck a leaf or a flower from anywhere. So there is emphasis on ensuring security, peace and safety of everybody in an exaggerated way. Now this could not have come about had there not been a very strong tradition coming from a prophet of God. So that was the second evidence. The third is, وَلِلَّهِ عَلَى النَّاسِ حِجُّ الْبَيْتِ. And for God, upon humans, is incumbent Hijjul Bayt, pilgrimage to the house. Man istata ilayhi sabila, whoever is able to find the means to undertake journey. So that's the third evidence. That is, you go to the house, you go to the city, and you would find that around this city there is an important act of worship, pilgrimage to the house called Hajj, which is binding on all humans who have the ability, the resources to undertake journey and do that important act of worship. So these three evidences have been mentioned in this verse to prove the fact that this city is the same city that was the first one created, established for God's worship, and that was done by Abraham. Towards the end, the verse says, وَمَنْ كَفَرَ, and whoever disbelieves, whoever rejects, فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ غَنِيٌّ عَنِ الْعَالَمِينَ, then God is free from the need of the worlds. That is, if despite knowing all these realities, despite getting all these evidences, if somebody still rejects the fact that Mecca is the city where the Almighty arranged for his first house to be erected, to be established, and it is the same city where ultimately the last of the prophets is going to come. If somebody doesn't want to believe even now, God is in no need of such people. This is quite evident if you look at the sequence of the two verses and the manner things have been mentioned in from one to the other and the third one. However, there are many Muslims who, because they have not taken into consideration the coherence that is there in these two verses and the manner facts have been presented, many Muslims believe that this verse at the very end of it is actually mentioning the fact that if you don't do Hajj, you are committing an act of disbelief. Not doing Hajj even when you have the resources to do it and the ability as well is something wrong, seriously wrong. But this verse is not saying that. This verse is actually talking about disbelief of those people who did not want to acknowledge and recognize the fact that house of God in Mecca is the very house that was erected by Abraham. Something that Jews had done as best as they could to hide and remove from their book. So the Almighty is condemning them and not making a statement regarding people who are not doing Hajj even when they have the ability and resources to do so. So that was an example which was meant to emphasize the fact that if we do not take coherence in the verses of the Quran and it's the mention of the Quran the way it has been done in the proper sequence, if we don't take into consideration this understanding that there is a logical sequence which is to be observed in the presentation of the Quran, we might not be able to understand some passages of the Quran the way they were meant and intended to be understood. Now I will give you an example briefly of one full surah, a brief surah which is presenting itself as one coherent statement from the Almighty. It's mentioning one message, but it's comprised of different passages, different paragraphs, who when looked at more carefully and deeply give an understanding that indeed there is only one message that is running through the different passages of this chapter, as indeed it is in the entire Quran. All the Quranic surahs, chapters are actually doing the same thing. The surah that I've chosen to bring out this reality is Surah Al-Jumu'ah, Surah number 62. It is comprised of 11 verses, and even if you look at its simple translation, you would come to learn about the fact that this surah is divided into 3 paragraphs. Verses 1 to 4 make one paragraph, 5 to 8 make another, and 9 to 11 the third paragraph. The surah is actually talking about the blessing that the Almighty has bestowed upon the children of Ishmael, in that God has sent His messenger to these people now, and therefore they should take the message seriously and should value it and not ignore it, or else they are going to be in serious trouble. The first 4 verses are therefore talking about the fact that it has been God's kindness upon His people who were ummi, unlettered, that He sent to them a messenger who recites to them His verses, does their tazkiyah, purification and growth, spiritual and moral growth, and teaches them the book, the law, and the wisdom, which we have already seen is comprised of morality, moral principles, as well as beliefs. This is what the first paragraph emphasizes. It mentions the fact that this is a great blessing the Almighty has bestowed upon a nation, the children of Ismail, and they must make sure that they are living up to the expectations that this status entails. The second paragraph is talking about something different. You find, as indeed in many cases of the Quran, that all of a sudden there is a new subject. From verse 5 to verse 8, what we read is that the Almighty is talking about the children of Israel who were given another book, Tawrat, but they did not take it seriously. They did not value it as it deserved. So the Quran says that the example of those who were given the responsibility of Torah and they did not undertake it properly is like the example of a donkey on which there is a load of books that has been placed, and obviously the donkey doesn't even know what treasure of knowledge is there on its back. It's a very bad example of those people who actually literally rejected the signs of God. And God Almighty never guides those people who are unfair to themselves, who don't perform well in the moral domain. And then goes on to mention the fact that these Jews, they think that they are the chosen people of the Almighty and therefore the next life has success for them in store. But the fact of the matter is that they will not ever be prepared to look forward to death. And therefore, the Almighty says that tell these people who are Jews that if you really think that you are the favorites of the Almighty, then wish for death. But they are never going to do it because they know what they have sent forth in the form of their deeds. And the Almighty says that tell them that the death that they are running away from is most certainly going to meet them, and it's going to take them towards before the Almighty, who knows all that is hidden and is manifest, and He is going to let you know about all that you used to do. Now this is the second passage, a completely different subject, talking about the fact that Jews were given a book, but they did not take it seriously. They did not fulfill the obligations that they were expected to as a consequence of being the custodians of the book. And the end result was that they ended up becoming extremely poor humans in moral performance. And the Almighty is going to reject them and their performance on the Day of Judgment. Obviously, the first passage and the second passage are bound, linked in an understanding that is actually conveying to the children of Ismail, those who have been given the Quran and the last prophet, to value what the Almighty has given them and not become like those who were given a book earlier and they did not take it seriously, and the end result was that they became, in the eyes of God, rejected people. They are not going to have any success in the hereafter. So, be careful. The third passage, which begins from verse 9 and goes on to verse 11, is a bit more difficult for it to get related to the rest of the two. It talks about the Jumu'ah prayer and asks believers to rush towards the prayers and leave aside all human activity, all worldly activities when the call for Jumu'ah prayer is given. And it also talks about the fact that after the Jumu'ah prayer is over, they can go back to their work, but remember God, they should remember God as much as is possible. Talks about the fact that there are some people who are not taking the Jumu'ah prayer at the moment seriously. When the prayer is going on, the khutbah is being delivered by the Prophet, and there is some caravan of trade coming close to the place or some other activity of entertainment happening, some people would get distracted and move towards those activities. The Almighty is asking Muslims to take Jummah prayer seriously and not get distracted by whatever else is happening. Obviously, it's a little difficult to see what exactly could be the reason why this passage has been placed in this particular surah. A little deeper reflection, however, will give a good idea as to why the Almighty has done so. While the first passage is talking about the Almighty's blessings on the children of Ismail, in that they have been given God's book and God's messenger. The second passage, verses 5 to 8, is telling them in the historical perspective of an example where a similar blessing was given and it was not given its due consideration. It was not taken seriously, and therefore the result was unpleasant for the people who were given that obligation. The idea is that the Muslims should learn their lessons from that historical example of the Jews and should take God's message seriously. The third passage is talking about the fact that the Muslims have now been given this message and they are expected to follow it properly. The Jummah prayer has been initiated for them, like many other expectations in the law, in the Sharia. They should not treat the Friday prayers like the Jews had done in the case of the Sabbath law. They were asked to observe the Sabbath law, the Saturday, the entire day, as a day entirely meant for the Almighty. No worldly activity was expected to be done, undertaken by them, and many Jews ignored the Almighty's expectations for Sabbath day. The Almighty is asking believers to make sure that they don't do so, and they should take the expectations of the Friday prayers seriously so that they succeed in ensuring that the message that they have been given by the Almighty is being treated seriously and properly by them, and that they succeed in this world and the next one. So, all in all, we have seen in these two presentations the fact that the Quranic surahs, when we see their verses, paragraphs coming next to each other, they have been sequenced in a manner that they appear very closely linked with each other as far as their meanings are concerned. The only thing is that the reader is expected to read these verses with deep reflection, and he is going to be able to get much more meanings out of his reading if he is trying to understand as to why one passage leads to another and the third one. In the next presentation, I am going to give you examples of the other two levels of coherence that we find in the Quran. That is, there are surah pairs in the Quran as well as there are surah groups in the Quran. I hope you will join me in the next session as well.